It looks like we have over 80 joining us today in this Zoom meeting, as well as additional online. And my name, by the way, is Michael Paulus. I'm the Dean of the Library and Assistant Provost for Educational Technology at South Pacific University. And I'm going to moderate the session we have today. And our keynote speaker, Andrew Yang, challenges us to reimagine the future of work, how our economy functions, how economic goods are distributed, and how we find meaning and purpose in work. In this session, with the help of two classicists, Dr. Owen Ewald, Professor of Classical Languages and Civilizations at South Pacific University, and Alden Smith, Professor of Classics at Baylor University, we're going to explore historical and theological resources for thinking about the future of work. We'll start with Dr. Ewald's talk, and then we'll go on to a talk by Dr. Smith. When they're done, I'll ask a couple of questions, historical and theological questions that both of them can engage with. And after that, we'll open it up to your questions and spend some time with those to finish up our hour together. So if you're in the Zoom meeting, you may submit your questions through the Q&A feature. You can also monitor the questions in there and upvote ones that you're specifically interested in us addressing. And with that, I will pass it off to you, Owen.
Thank you, Michael, for that introduction. And I'm grateful to everyone who is tuning in to hear me speak. What follows is my take on theology and the future of work, but through the lens of past texts. I want to warn you that I might be a little light on the future, but I hope to be heavy enough on the theology. I hear a lot of things about how the future of work is going to be different, but humans do not have substantially different bodies or minds from thousands of years ago. To underline my point, I will look at 5 ancient texts about work: the parable of the workers in the vineyard from Matthew's Gospel, an anecdote of Suetonius' biography of the Emperor Vespasian, one of Pliny the Younger's letters, a passage about a working animal in Apuleius' Metamorphoses, and a brief story from the sayings of the desert elders from 4th and 5th century AD. For my first text, in these texts, I find at least 5 ideas that might be useful for the future of work. First, do not exceed a full day, even if you cannot match an ancient dawn to dusk schedule. Second, use a helpful metaphor for work, something that emphasizes variety rather than repetition. Third, think about what creates or destroys paying work for others, especially in light of automation or labor-saving devices. Fourth, do not be overly focused on what you think you deserve for your work, whether money or spiritual benefit. Fifth and finally, do not over-identify your work or think of yourself as your job. For my first text, I want to read a semi-familiar passage from the Gospel of Matthew, the parable of the vineyard. Jesus said, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and sent them into his vineyard. About 9 in the morning, he went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. He told them, 'You also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right.' And so they went. He went out again about noon and about 3 in the afternoon and did the same thing. About 5 in the afternoon, he went out and found still others standing around. He asked them, 'Why have you been standing here all day long doing nothing?' 'Because no one has hired us,' they answered. He said to them, 'You also go and work in my vineyard.' When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, 'Call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going on to the first.' The workers who were hired about 5 in the afternoon came and each received a denarius. So when those came who were hired first, they expected to receive more. But each one of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. 'These who were hired last worked only 1 hour,' they said, 'and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day.' But he answered one of them, 'I am not being unfair to you, friend. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous? So the last will be first, and the first will be last." There ends the parable. I have quoted the whole thing because in one place we find themes that we will see again. First, note that the parable is framed by morning and evening, and the daylight hours are time for work. This truth is more prominent for ancient agriculture, since typically agricultural work was not done by lamplight, even though there were a few ancient occupations that were done at night, often to prepare for the day. At the risk of offending those with a late adolescent sleep cycle, let me say in my personal experience that the day is more productive for most people. When I push work into the later evening, I disrupt my sleep cycle and cannot rise to meet the next day. Second, there is no intrinsic relationship between labor and wage. The wage here is based on the task, not the hours, and it is set by a rather arbitrary agreement between employer and employee. I know that this sounds a bit libertarian, but let me point to the grumbling of the earlier workers. These who were hired last worked only 1 hour, they said, and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the work in the heat of the day. The employer has an idea of a fair wage. I will pay you whatever is right, but the employees do not agree. Maybe there is an ideal of a fair wage, but it's not often put into practice. In other words, the parable agrees with our observation that the relationship between labor and wage is often arbitrary, at least in this world. Okay. But this parable also suggests that your true value does not depend on your hourly rate, nor on the job you happen to be hired to do. Okay. The laborers in the marketplace could have been hired for a wide variety of tasks. I could bring up how much Jeff Bezos makes every second versus one of his warehouse workers, but that is well known. Third, look at how much slack there is in the labor system. Note that people are hanging out in the marketplace, still looking for work at 5 in the afternoon. And they will especially appreciate the wage of a denarius, the average skilled wage for a day, to cover the time they spent working plus the time they spent waiting for work. Unemployment was a huge problem in the ancient world, since especially at Rome, unemployment tended to produce political unrest, okay, or people hiring themselves out as political thugs for one faction or another. This brings us to our next passage from Suetonius' Life of the Emperor Vespasian. The Emperor Vespasian ruled, let's say, 69 to 79 AD. Suetonius often has a tenuous relationship with the truth and is more interested in his subjects' sex lives than in their economic policies. But in a section featuring a grab bag of sayings of the Emperor Vespasian, Suetonius relates that Vespasian was concerned about the level of employment on his projects in the city of Rome. And when a craftsman was promising that he would bring the large marble columns onto the Capitoline Hill at small expense, the emperor refused the reward in exchange for a comment that was above average. He sent back the device after declaring that he would allow the lower class to feed themselves. End quote. We know that the columns were brought up to restore the building on the Capitoline Hill, known as the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, one of Rome's oldest and biggest temples. Vespasian started or finished several building projects, such as the Temple of Peace in Rome, and even in other cities, like Brixia in northern Italy. In other words, Vespasian's public works projects were not simply for the beautification of his empire and propaganda for himself, and to prevent being deposed by angry mobs, but to provide jobs for impoverished Romans, specifically the bottom of the economic pyramid, even if that meant jobs like schlepping a column up a hill. The Latin word I translate here as lower class, plebicula, literally means little people. Those of a certain age may remember Leona Helmsley, the hotel magnate and the queen of mean. She commented to one of her staff, "Only the little people pay taxes." But Vespasian knew that he needed to keep the little people working in order to tax them to fund his empire. With this quote, I am not advocating shutting down all the machines to get to full employment like the Luddites. Rather, I recommend not automating a job like truck driving out of existence before we figure out what the little people, such as 3 million truck drivers, could do for a living instead. I will now move from the little people to the other end of the income spectrum. Here is Pliny the Younger on his work as an author. He has found a good way to frame a work activity, writing, in terms of a leisure activity, hunting. Or at least hunting is leisure in an agricultural society for those who own farms. These farms might be better called plantations, worked by enslaved and hired laborers, and their labor made Pliny's leisure possible. Pliny writes to his friend Cornelius Tacitus, "You will laugh, and you may laugh. I, that guy you know, captured 3 really beautiful wild boars. All by yourself, you say? By myself, but still not so that I completely left my sluggishness and rest. I was sitting near the hunting nets. Nearby was no hunting spear nor light spear, but a pen and writing tablets. I was thinking about something and writing it down so that I might bring back empty hands, but full writing tablets. It is not the case that you scorn this type of studying. It is amazing how my mind is roused by the shaking and moving of my body. Now, wherever in the woods there are both solitude and silence itself that is provided for hunting, they are great inducements for thought. Therefore, when you hunt, it will be allowed, by my idea, for you to bring writing tablets, just like a picnic basket and a drinking flask. You will prove that Diana, goddess of the hunt, does not wander in the mountains more than Minerva, goddess of crafts. Farewell. End quote. 4 things stand out here. First, this is a work metaphor, bagging literary productions such as this letter itself like big game. This metaphor is so fully developed that we are unsure whether Pliny actually went out to the woods to hunt or not, whether the hunting nets are ready in Latin are literal or metaphorical. Second, the work is delimited. There's a time to work and a time not to work, and when the tablets are full, work is over. Third, elite creative work can be seen as a game, or in modern terms, gamified. Fourth, we are not brains in vats or on sticks, but people with bodies that need to shake and move in order for our brains to think. In a famous ancient novel, The Metamorphoses or the Golden Ass, the hero Lucius turns into a donkey because of a misapplied magic potion, a scene that inspired Pinocchio, both novel and movie. He has several adventures as a donkey, and he endures mistreatment that would be unthinkable for a Roman male citizen whose body could not be touched except in punishment or in battle, but all too common for an animal or for an enslaved person. Even though he saves a young princess from bandits by galloping away with her on his back, he is soon again put to work powering a grain mill by walking in a circle to grind one millstone against another. He writes, quote, "You see, the miller's wife, that truly greedy and most wicked woman, immediately gave me over to powering the mill while continually whipping me with a leafy branch. Anyhow, no allotted grain rations were offered to wretched me in exchange for such great labors, for she kept selling to neighboring farms my barley ration that was supposed to be the harvest from my escapes, but allotting to me, obligated to power the mill with my work throughout the day till mid-evening, only chaff caked together and dirty and gritty from the large grindstone." End quote. Ancient mills were powered by running water or by animals or humans walking in circles. They featured lots of whipping and repetition and exploitation. In particular, Lucius notes that the food given to him as a reward for rescuing the princess, the harvest from my escapes, is ground up and sold to others. The phrase "to me, obligated to power the mill with my work throughout the day until mid-evening," sounds a particular note of despair. Since the narrator Lucius still thinks like a human, even though he has the body of a donkey, he can think about his donkey-like suffering in human terms. And readers can draw analogies to the suffering of enslaved people of that time and throughout human history. Moreover, the truism that you are not your job applies especially to tasks you are forced to do, as well as we see that this is an example of not respecting the day and its limitations. With the next passage, we move back to Christianity, where we began, and the sayings of the elders of the 4th and 5th centuries AD. This is a collection of sayings of monks who fled to the desert from the cities of the late Roman Empire in order to grow closer to God. In this passage, the worker is not a vineyard worker trying to earn a denarius, but a monk attacked with erotic dreams about his long-dead wife. The story goes, they used to say about one of the fathers that he was from the world, and he was being attacked with erotic dreams on account of his wife. Therefore, he kept telling this to the elders, and since they knew that he was a worker and doing more duties than the ones they were telling him to, they began to impose on him rules so as for his body to grow weak and not to be able to revolt any longer. End quote. An elder comes from another monastery and discovers the sad result of this discipline. The monk's body grows weak from overwork, but his troubling dreams actually increase. The visiting elder advises him, "While eating your small meal, cast your care on the Lord, for you cannot prevail over this trouble by your own efforts. And you see, our body is like a coat. If you care for it, it stands up, but if you neglect it, it rots." End quote. The story concludes, the suffering monk followed the advice and was cured. 2 things stand out. First, in a monastic context, as in the world, there is a temptation to overwork, to go beyond a full day, which should be avoided. The body is indeed like a coat and needs to be treated with care so that God can work upon us and through us. In this moment, we particularly need our body's immune response at full strength to keep us alive to help others. Second, Work does not cure mental or spiritual problems, especially when it is overwork and begins to destroy the body. Since we are not our jobs, throwing ourselves into work does not restore our true selves. Instead, the psalmist's advice to use prayer is more effective, to cast on the Lord our anxieties, that we may return to our true selves without that burden. In closing, I want to recap my main points. First, do not exceed a full day, even if your work times do not match up to the ancient agricultural timetable or the 20th century 9 to 5. Second, use a helpful metaphor for work, perhaps a hunt or a game, rather than walking in a circle around millstones day after day. Third, think about how your choices create or destroy paying work for others. Fourth, do not be overly focused on what you think you deserve for your work. And finally, do not over-identify with your work. That last point is one I especially need to hear, since I think of my work as a calling rather than a task. Yet to God, it is no more special than picking up recycling from the student union. And here I want to read a brief prayer associated with the Saint Anselm of Aosta. And it goes, "Come now, insignificant person, free for a while your usual occupations. Hide yourself for a time from disturbing thoughts. Cast aside for now burdensome cares. Free yourself a little for God and for whatever may help you in your search for God. Close the door and seek God. Speak now, my whole heart. Speak to God. I seek your face, O Lord. Your face I seek." Thank you. And now I will gratefully hand the baton to Professor Alden Smith of the Department of Classics of Baylor University.
Thank you, Owen, and thank you for a wonderful talk, very thought-provoking, and really something perfect to lead into what I'd like to say next. And before I start with my talk, which is entitled Ora et Labora, the benchmark for future of human vocation question, I would like to thank you, Owen, and I'd also like to thank Vice Provost Copeland and Paulus for this opportunity to speak here at this conference. And I'd also like to give a shout out to Taylor, Madison, and Martin for making this session work. So if you can hear me, thank you very much, Martin. I'd like to just begin with a reflection about what happened in 2016 when a major earthquake struck Norcia, which is a city in Perugia, in Italy, in what the Romans called Umbria. Over 300 people tragically died there, and much of the town was destroyed, including a basilica of St. Benedict, which was the central place of worship for the monks that lived in that town. These Benedictine monks of Norcia had to remake the monastery's central place of worship, which is now a sizable chantry made out of wood, with the look of a rustic country chapel rather than the traditional stone Catholic sanctuary, and it's located just outside of Norcia proper. If I recall correctly, it was in July of 2017 when I accompanied my then dean, Thomas Hibbs, who's now the president of the University of Dallas, to Norcia. Having wrapped up some university business in Rome, we made the pilgrimage in part for a short spiritual retreat. And for me, at least, for a bit of repose after having bent my back on an archaeological dig earlier that month. Also on our priority list was the mutual quest of fellowship and friendship. We stayed in a nice hotel in whose hallway was an antique bench engraved with the Latin phrase ora et labora. That it should be there on a bench is not surprising, as the dictum is, after all, a summary of St. Benedict's Regula, the central document of the Benedictine order. The great 6th century saint hailed from that medieval town, then known as Nursia, even if the Regula itself would later be written in Monte Cassino. I thought about that phrase the next day as we went to the chapel to reflect and to pray for a town in recovery and to listen to the monks' surpassing beautiful Gregorian chants. On the way out of the chapel, we just happened to run into a well-known Christian blogger and author, the author of the Benedict option, Rod Dreher, a friend of Tom Hibbs. The monks then offered us all a tour of the grounds as they spoke in very personal terms of their calling. In their case, beyond their commendable care for the poor in the Perusian community, their particular craft comprised making some of the best beer in the world, which they generously offered us a sample of straight from these fermentation tank. But even as I quaffed that small draft, I kept thinking about the devastating effects of the earthquake, the evidence of which was everywhere. And I kept pondering the words of the Benedictine bench. With its pithy maxim, the bench was saying something different about calling. It was saying that we, its readers, need to call out to God, and then we need to get to work, ora et labora. It's everything I'd always thought about calling reversed. Not hearken unto God's call, but rather call out to God and then work. I begin with this story because my talk today is not about the future of work per se, but it is about the attitude with which we can best approach work, whether now or in the future. In the past, broadly speaking, work was not always seen as a calling per se. Among the ancients and in most places and most times in milieu, work has simply been a means to an end, and that end is survival. But even within this, which someone might regard as a rather banal view of work, one can find dignity. Many passages in Proverbs, for example, suggest that our daily work can have inherent beauty. To take but one example, that of the industrious woman from the end of Proverbs, the writer writes, "Give her the fruit of her hands, and let her own works praise her in the gates." Work for the exemplary woman of Proverbs 31 is not simply a means to an end, not simply a way of generating household income. It is that, but it's more. It's the expression of creation, and human creation is the imitation of God. It is an opportunity for humans to transcend the ordinary by crafting something extraordinary. In the Greco-Roman world, the practical goal of work was, again, chiefly that of survival. Yet for certain professions, the Greeks introduced an element of competition. For the athlete, of course, that is not surprising. The Greeks loved athletic competition, and at their Panhelletic festivals, athletic contests were common from 776 BC, when the first Olympic Games were held. Perhaps not everyone knows that the Pythian Games in Delphi are reputed to have begun not with athletic contests, but with artistic and terpsichorean contests. Apollo was the god of the arts, and with poetic ones as well. In Athens, meanwhile, kitharists, flautists, and singers all competed at the Panathenaic Games. Pliny the Elder also speaks of artistic contests per se, such as that between Cresslus, Polykleitos, Phidias, and Phradmon, who entered a competition to see whose statue of an Amazon could stand in the temple of Artemis at Ephesus. The Romans took the Greek competitiveness, particularly in law and politics, and enhanced it. While art tended to be esteemed for aesthetic value and enshrouded less in competition, the Roman poets Horace and Virgil did not compete with one another, for example, whereas on the Greek side, Euripides and Sophocles did. Roman politics was at least as rough as that of the Greeks. Cicero's house was burnt to the ground by a political rival, and he was forced into exile for about a year. After that exile, when he wrote his philosophical and rhetorical treatises, Cicero did not write one on work per se, but he did write one on duties. And in that 3-volume treatise, he offers lasting insights into civic responsibilities, reminding his reader from the outset that no part of life is without moral duty. And though it comes from a later period, a gnomic maxim found among the Dicta Catonis reflects the pragmatic view of work that the Romans held. When labor is held in contempt, the maxim says, mortal poverty waxes. We know that St. Paul, whose ministry abounded just a century after Cicero's Florowit, saw his personal labor, qua tent maker, as chiefly in the service of the gospel. But Paul's view of work was, in a sense, sui generis, not simply because it is cast in the context of his vibrant ministry that laid the foundation for Christianity, but rather, as any student of the New Testament who has contrasted the work of the view of work in the book of James with that of Paul knows, for Paul, the notion of work at least in the context of proving one's own worthiness before God, was futile, to say the least. In fact, in spite of some less than fully clear passages, such as Colossians 1:24, by and large, Paul saw a works righteousness mentality as essentially detracting from the work of Christ on the cross. In Romans, he writes, "Therefore all flesh," and by flesh he means humankind, "shall not be declared righteous in God's sight by the works of the law. For through the law there is recognition of sin." Christ's view of work, if one can say that, is expressed in the gospel accounts, when it's expressed in the gospel accounts, is parabolic and, as a consequence, provocatively thought-provoking. He speaks of day laborers in the vineyard, as Professor Ewald mentioned in Matthew 20, as meriting the same pay, no matter how long they work. He speaks to his disciples of fields that lack workers, but are white for the harvest in the book of John. And he uses his own works in that same book as evidence of his unity with God. But this is all a long way from our bench, and I want to return to that bench through another antique voice, also one from the Bible, namely that of St. Peter. His views are a bit less striking and bold than those of St. Paul. Paul's utter abolishment of works as a means of earning one's righteousness parallel the radical, if I may use that term, views of Christ about the workers earning equal pay for quite unequal work. When it comes to St. Peter, we find that he employs language that resonates with Old Testament prophecy. Specifically, he harks back to Isaiah, speaking of the people of God as called out of darkness into light. For Peter, calling is God's rescue work, and the result of that calling is to declare praises to him who called you. Jesus' words show that mercy is sometimes doled out lavishly, and from a human point of view, unfairly. Peter goes back to the Old Testament idea of the believer being called out of darkness, not merely to be saved, but to serve God and others, to work. For the sake of time and unity, I shall skip over the notion of indulgences and the medieval idea that the Christian must do good works to be saved. And I shall also skip over Luther's emphasis on, or re-emphasis, I should say, on grace and faith, which is well known both in Protestant and in Catholic circles. A line from C.S. Lewis's Learning in Wartime to this very well. The work of a Beethoven and the work of a charwoman become spiritual on precisely the same condition, that of being offered to God, Lewis writes. And even if it might not fit well at this point, I shall not even if it might fit well at this point, I shall not retell the hackneyed and possibly spurious story of the cobbler who asked Luther about his work. Luther is said to have stated that putting a cross on each shoe does not glorify God, but rather good craftsmanship does. Yet the bench of Norcia offers us a much more concise and really memorable dictum, ora et labora. And now I would like to reorient the direction of this talk toward the future, for there is something about that bench's engraving that resonates too with the teaching of Christ that is, like this conference, future-oriented. The bench, you see, presupposes that the reader has not yet done, or at least at the time of reading of the bench, which it prescribes, has not yet done what it tells you to do. The imperative mood works that way in Latin and in other languages. Though it speaks in the present, it nevertheless de facto is referring to a future event, whether immediately, call on God right now and get to work right now, or subsequent to the reading of the bench. Say, when you get a chance, say a prayer, won't you, and then get down to your business. The bench doesn't say which is intended, and much can be left to the reader. This is, after all, a bench, by virtue of which it is an object for sitting, and therefore it might indicate to the reader that the reader should sit down for a few minutes and pray. Thus, the command on the bench expresses something that is yet to be prayed for and something that is yet to be done. The bench's orientation toward future action is something that can be understood by anyone. The admonition to work and even to work hard is good advice across the board, across racial, ethnic, religious, gender-based, and any other type of societal or human distinction. But the other imperative of that old bench, the first one, ura, call upon God in prayer, seems to be directed primarily at those who understand it, those who see the bench and recognize that it's not suggesting a moral or a spiritual benchmark, but a simple admonition of how to approach the future of work. Do so, the bench is saying to us, with a prayer first. That's something the Christian reader will understand, and it's something that orients the Christian bench reader toward the future of work in a way that is optimistic, is bold and courageous, is other-oriented, and done right will really be selfless. But I spoke a moment ago about a saying of Christ that dovetails with that bench bon mot. Indeed, it is another future glimpse of work among the teachings of Christ. When Christ speaks parabolically, as usual, about men's works being fruits, he concludes his discussion of those who do bad versus those who do good with a famous line. Then you will recognize them, at least from their fruits. Now, the translation may not be familiar to you, in part because it's my own. It's rather stiff and literal rendering of the Greek, but I do so to emphasize a small word in Greek, a mere particle, that is, by and large, passed over by translators. That word is get. It means at least, and Matthew seems to want us to know that Jesus here is saying that you will recognize the people discussed here, at least by their fruits, that is, their works. You may recognize the bad ones, the false prophets, by bad works, but you will also recognize the good ones, the true believers, by their good works. And how do you do that? I think the bench will give us the answer. The good works are wrought by those who understand what the bench means about calling to do good works, to the future of work. The bench tells us to pray and then to work. And Jesus tells us that you will recognize those around you as good from the good work. That is the unique combination of praying and then working. That's my own version of a Benedictine option, not isolating or hunkering down in a world gone mad, but praying first and then working, whether pell-mell, as befits some personalities, or with a more laid-back rhythm, or something in between, as Dr. Ewald pointed out, is probably the best. So I leave you with that old bench's dictum as a kind of benchmark for sanity in an increasingly insane world. Pray and then work. Maybe, if we're lucky, someday someone will know us, at least by the fruit that distinctive but humble combination produces. Thank you.
Well, thank you both for bringing so many sources of wisdom into this discussion about the future of work and resources for reflecting theologically on that. I'd like to remind everybody who's joined us to submit your questions through the Q&A function or vote up a question that you see that you like. But I would like to put a couple of broad questions out there for both of our speakers to engage with. Again, to help us reflect theologically about our unique moment in history. So first, more of a historical question. Owen, you mentioned that our bodies and minds haven't changed a whole lot over the last few thousand years. But over the last few hundred years, we've seen significant social and technological changes associated with what are called the four industrial revolutions. So steam power, electricity, digital computers, and now transformative technologies such as big data and artificial intelligence. So as we consider patterns of continuity and change over time, how do we go about bringing wisdom from the past into our new technological context? And Owen, do you want to answer that?
Sure. Thank you, Michael. Okay. I'm a historian. I'm really not a historian of recent eras. More, I'd say, the agricultural revolution than the industrial revolution. I think I can offer a little bit of wisdom here. For instance, electric lights that were invented around 1876 have allowed us to see what we were doing 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But our bodies and minds have not changed to work 24/7. They still need rest and a rhythm of the day, that is sleep, and in the rhythm of the week, that is Sabbath in the Jewish and Christian traditions. And we have plenty of data about sleep deprivation from prisoners of war and about burnout from people who never get a Sabbath. I might even add from essential workers and medical workers who have been working since March without significant breaks. I'll even add too that artificial intelligence, perhaps the fourth industrial revolution, it may replace routine tasks or lead people through checklists to help them troubleshoot a problem or even to figure out what they want. But being understood by an AI system, yes, you want this item in blue, versus being understood by a person, yes, you feel alienated by so many Zoom meetings, seems to be qualitatively different. What we mean by understood is a different thing in both cases. One's about information and the other's about empathy. Chatbots that use AI can give off signals associated with empathy. They can recognize the language of emotion and produce a text that says, I know how you feel, but they cannot really know how I feel. They cannot feel the same thing that I feel. One of our colleagues was involved in research that explored the question of whether a view of nature in a TV monitor could replace a view of nature through a window. And the answer decisively, statistically, scientifically was no. Our brains are not fooled. The TV monitor is not as satisfying as looking at real nature. I would urge us to remember human nature and what is real versus an image of what's real. Okay, and I hope that's at least something to chew on, at least a stab at that question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Alden, do you have comments or responses?
Sure. Yeah, it's, Dr. Ewald's talk is predicated on this idea that is sometimes controversial today about whether or not humans are very different now than when they were 2,000 years ago. And I think that he's taking the same view I would, which is that yes, things have changed and people change somewhat. Of course, our environment changes us to a degree, but that in essence, there's something fundamentally the same. And as he said, with the dawn of electric lights, that doesn't mean we should work 24 hours just because we can. And of course, our body needs to recharge now as it did in antiquity. And so certainly we think we've got different things that have happened in the lives of human beings that have definitely colored our outlook and even, made us think differently about moral questions. But there is something what Lucretius calls the alte terminus hirens, which is this deeply clinging boundary stone, which makes people fundamentally and nature fundamentally the same, even when things change around you, even when technology changes. So I think as we look forward to the future of work, I think one of the things that would be helpful for all people, whether they're spiritual people or not spiritual people, is to try to find those deeply clinging boundary stones that are essentially human, that are shared, between faiths or even between people of non-faith, with people of faith, and to try to figure out what it is that we can say, even if we don't agree on, but we can say is true. I mean, and I think this is one of the challenges that lies before us as we go forward and try to address work that comes in the future, or just tries to address as we try to address anything that lies in the future. We have to try to find those common human fundamentally true things and work from those as the points of departure. It doesn't mean we'll come to the same conclusions, but we need to start with some kind of point of departure. And I think those shared human experiences and fundamentally human things are where we start. If I can just throw in I don't want to take up any more time, but just one of the questions that came here on the Q&A was about the Benedictine option by Rod Dreher. I have a book in front of me right here. It's a really wonderful book. I wasn't criticizing that book. I was just saying that one of the dangers of what Rod is saying, I think in the book is that there is a kind of isolationist tone to the book, and I think for people who teach at Azusa Pacific or teach at Baylor University or students who go there or anyone else associated with any aspect of the capital C broad-based idea of church is the notion that we could sort of decide that the society is going down such a dangerous or a slippery slope that we don't want to fully engage it. I'm not saying that Rod is really saying that, but there's a sense in which there's an isolationist tone, and I think that's just to let that person know with a question about that. That's I think I would part ways there a little bit with Rod on that particular point. But anyway.
So to go back a little bit, both of you are providing a sort of a helpful grounding for us in thinking about human nature and what we know about humans from, centuries and millennia of reflection on human nature. And even though we are sort of confronting new technologies and new technological phenomena, and recognizing the differences of that, that does resonate with the sort of human capitalism that Yang does talk about. I'd also like to ask you more of a theological question. Alden, you touched on a number of theological perspectives on work, from Jesus to C.S. Lewis, and these point to a trajectory of deepening reflection on work as vocation, something that we're called to do in the world. And we see something similar, a similar trajectory in the Bible. In Genesis, humans are put in the garden to do, till the ground, to do very kind of an ancient form of agricultural work. But at the end of the biblical narrative, you have a rather different image, a technological image, really, of a city, the city of God. And this is the crowning vision of new creation, into which humans, the rulers and people of the nations, bring into this the honor and glory of the nations, which many commentators, suggest could include our works, things that we have created, the good things we have created. And so I'd like both of you to respond to this idea that reflecting on the future is helpful for us as we reflect on work and vocation. And Alden, would you like to start?
Sure, I'd be glad to. Thanks for a really stimulating, good question. When you look at the book of Revelation, it's funny, work comes off, there's a good and bad side to work in the book, right? I mean, the judgment of the churches is about their works, and it doesn't come off really well for the churches in the sort of, I know your works, I've seen your works, and they're not great, says the Lord. Sometimes they're lukewarm, and sometimes they're even worse. So the words deeds or works in the book of Revelation don't always come off well, but they do come off well, of course, when we're talking about what God is doing. And I think, when we look to the future, of work in America and the world, and the way especially through the Christian lens, the way I think to look at it is one way to look at it is what the book of Revelation ultimately says is what's really amazing about the work of Revelation is the work of what God has done, that he has created this eternal city, that he has provided for his people. And so not to over theologize it, because there's a practical side to this too, but a lot of the practical side of sort of thinking about what God has done in his redemptive work is to try to imitate that. I think for the Christian in particular, that doesn't mean going to the cross necessarily, obviously. But what it means is being redemptive in the way we work, in the way that we work in the workplace, having a redemptive attitude, and one that is grace-filled, and is gracious and full of. And when I say grace, I really mean what grace ultimately is forgiveness, right? So it's that free gift of forgiveness. And I think if we have those attitudes when we go to work in the future, and we bring that to whatever technology we're facing, I think the redemptive attitude, the kind and forgiving and gracious attitude, is something that I think can really both be effective now in our work environment, and as we face technological changes in the future, I think it could be a great point of departure, a great thought process for us as people and as Christian people.
Thank you. Owen, would you like to respond?
So I also want to build on, let's say, Dr. Smith's view of work as, let's say, of God's redemptive work as putting a larger frame around everything that we do, around our existence. And indeed, how to bridge that gap between work capital W and work with a small w is a big challenge. I also find it helpful to distinguish between the near future, a future where artificial intelligence may be reshaping the economy in ways that we're struggling to understand, and the far future, where God's redeeming work is complete, where there's no more pain or death or grief, but life eternal, as in Revelation 21. I mean, in the near future, we need to figure out how to translate our sense of vocation into paying work as much as possible. And this may even mean such new things as salaries for stay-at-home parents. If we value the caring economy, we need to fund it, as Mr. Yang points out. And I hope that there are ways we can use the far future, the city of God, a city devoted to love for one another, as a vision for how to shape the near future. We've seen similar things in how science fiction authors often use a fictional far future to point out ways we can do better now. But I suspect that in the far future, God has something amazing in mind, something we could not even have predicted, to cultivate our full humanity in the context of eternal life. So thank you, Michael.
Yeah, thank you, Owen. We have a couple questions from Paul Lee here. One of the, so what there's, there's sort of the distinction between work and vocation. We've sort of used those words and sort of slipped in and out of them. Would one of you like to tackle that one?
I'd be glad to, Owen. I'll take the first
Sure.
crack. Again, thank you, Paul Lee, for your good question. I think, when I look at the phrase ora et labora, I think before I got to Norcia, I always thought of that phrase as the two sort of things you should do: pray and work. These are your this is the summary of the regula. And I don't think that's wrong. That is certainly true. And that could be our vocation, right? That our calling to God is to glorify him by praying and by working. And I'd always thought of that because that wasn't the first time I saw the phrase. I mean, it was the first time I'd seen it engraved on a bench, that's all. But it's certainly not the first time. I knew it was the summary of the regula, probably not written by Benedict himself, by the way, but just by his followers, who summarized the entire regula by that phrase. And it was adopted by many monks through many ages, and it still is. But my point is that I always saw those as parallel ideas. I always thought them as, pray and work. And then it was only when I went to Norcia that I started thinking of them as not parallel, but as part of this giant vocation. But I started thinking of them as sort of, X first and then Y, or A first and then B. And that was the first time that dawned on me. So, to try to answer the question, which is, again, the question of vocation versus calling. I think the most important thing, I think I was let me back up very quickly. When I was a student at Dickinson College, where I went to undergraduate school, I asked one of my professors about this. I asked him, he's a Christian professor, his name was Bob Sider, and I asked him, how do I know that I'm really called to go on in academia? And he told me basically what the bench said, without quoting the bench, which was, God may not put our desires in our hearts, is what Bob Sider said. But he said he's certainly prepared to deal with them. And I think that is the idea that of thinking about, we sometimes overthink what vocation might mean. We might really think, I need to know what I'm supposed to do with my life. I hear this from my students all the time. What am I supposed to do with my life? What is God calling me to do? And I think the bench is telling us, don't worry about that. Pray and then go work, and you'll figure it out. And I think, so to balance the question of vocation out, I think one of the things I figured out by getting old is that what I'm doing is not nearly important as the attitude with which I'm doing it. I don't know if that really answers the question. Owen, maybe you can do better with this one.
Sure. No, I think that's a very good way of talking about it. I'd say that vocation is often, guided by the Spirit, preceded by prayer, done with the right attitude or the right frame around it. I even wonder whether it's the distinction between work and vocation is akin to the distinction between, let's see, management and leadership that often gets talked about, or where management is doing things right, that's work, okay, versus leadership doing the right things, okay, which is vocation. So the right things would include, I'd say, not only all the tasks on your to-do list, but also the things that you do to follow Jesus. That you pray, that you that you visit the sick and the shut in, okay, or that you give a word of encouragement to somebody who needs it at the right moment. So I think like vocation is sort of much more broadly encompassing than I'd say than what we happen to have been hired to do.
I agree with that.
Good.
There's also an important distinction between work for pay, for some sort of economic, benefit, or some, versus just work, which is just completing a task or laboring towards some end. And often work is used to talk about what your job, what you're paid to do. But I think in the biblical text, when you look at God creating, God's work of creating the world, different human works, whether they're to perform tasks, till the ground, or works of righteousness or whatever. I mean, those are different kinds of not for compensation, right? And Paul also asked a question about Babel, which is another sort of ancient text that's an interesting kind of focal point for reflection on technology, I think. And I kind of wonder if either of you like to sort of take up that. What do we learn from Babel? Is it a clear sort of judgment against technology or a particular form of technological hubris? Since we see technology before Babel, but a lot of theologians and Christian thinkers have looked at Babel as a judgment of technology in particular.
I'll take a quick stab at that. I think my first thought is that let's see that I'd say that it's not even so much technology as I'd say technology that neglects human factors. The fact that that you not only need to figure out how to stack up the bricks or how to build up the foundations of the tower in such a way that it won't fall down, but that you also need to take into account the fact that you've got several different workers, each with their own histories, culture, and explicitly in the Tower of Babel, language. Speakers yesterday mentioned the fact that diverse teams are stronger teams, okay? And that you need to be aware of that and be able to communicate across boundaries rather than make the goal of simply building the tallest tower the only goal of your enterprise. Okay.
Yeah, I agree with that, Owen. I would just enhance it slightly with a strange anecdote from my own life. I grew up in a town called New Hope, Pennsylvania, which is a very progressive town near Philadelphia, an art community, and a very interesting town. And when I was a very young child, there was a Methodist church in the middle of the town, kind of the central focus, I guess, spiritually of the town, where a lot of the town people went to church. But over the years, the town became, I would say, a little bit less spiritually oriented, and eventually the church folded. The building was sold, and the last time I was in town, if I'm not mistaken, it was a drug paraphernalia shop. Now, again, if you're a drug user, I'm not trying to criticize anyone for, I'm not trying to make anybody feel uncomfortable here if there's a drug user in the audience, but I am saying it was quite a different thing from its old days when it had been a church to this sort of drug paraphernalia place. So the point of that whole story is that it's not the building, it's not the technological platform that is important necessarily, it's how it's used. So I think, again, not to overemphasize this, but it is the attitude which you use Twitter, right? If your point of using Twitter, just picking on Twitter, if your point of using Twitter is just to be obnoxious, then I think, it's a misuse of the technology. But if your point of using Twitter is for something much more positive, then it's a good use of it. So the technology itself, I think of not as exactly Babelic or, pertaining to the Tower of Babel, but necessarily any more than building that church was necessarily Christian. The church was a building. In it for years and years, Christians worshiped. Eventually, not so much. Maybe someday in the future it will be used for Christian worship again. Who knows? But the point is that it's not the technology per se that is bad, but it is the way it's used.
Great, thank you.
Good.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. Let's see, Helen has a question about the spiritual conditions necessary for enabling people to do different kinds of work. We want to reimagine work. How do we cultivate these conditions? Any thoughts about that?
Owen, you want to go?
Sure. I'll jump in with that. Let's see. I'd say, one thing that's been helpful for me is to think back to my own kind of formation about the conditions under which I grew up and how many people, let's say, including my mother, my father, my Sunday school teachers, did all kinds of work that helped shape me into the person who I am. Okay, and how that was as important as learning to write the alphabet, in who I became. So I'd say even thinking back to our own experience and our benefit and how we benefited from work might help to shift attitudes towards an idea that that child rearing or elder care could be compensated, or that we could put our money where our mouth is in terms of making sure that people are compensated for the work they do, even if we don't get to the true value, but at least to recognize it as important, to recognize how we benefited from it and how we may need it one day. Thanks.
Right. I like to pick up on that last word that Dr. Ewald just said, which is how we may need it someday. I'm in a department in a classics department with 14 colleagues, and two of them were my students many years ago when I started out my career. So it's funny how when you're teaching, sometimes you think of yourself as the professor and the students as students. But you don't realize they might be your boss. One of them is now the undergraduate director in the department. I report directly to him. So I think as we treat other people, whether they have a job that is one that maybe doesn't require a high level of education to do, but is an important and critical job for society, we need to, again, be generous and kind. And in terms of compensating, that's harder to address. I mean, especially for two classicists who have no real knowledge of, at least I speak for myself, of economic theory. But obviously, it's an important question because people need to be paid. Let the worker be paid for what he's worth, right? So I think that's an important question, not one I can fully address, but I do know that the attitude of treating other people the way you would want to be treated if the roles were reversed as well. I just stole that from somebody. It's called the golden rule.
It's a good rule to end with. So thank you, Alden and Owen, for your comments, your reflections around this topic, and for joining us today. And all of you who were able to join us, thank you for your time and attention. And I'd like to invite you to the next session, tomorrow's session, tomorrow afternoon at 2:30 on the jobs of tomorrow. But thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael and Alden.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Yes.